All right, welcome to today's explainer. We're jumping right in to trace what is honestly an inescapable domino effect, going from 18th century global warfare straight through to the American Revolution. We usually look at historical events in a vacuum, but today we're connecting the dots. We're going to see how a series of massive global dominoes fell perfectly into place to basically birth a nation.
So here's a question to challenge the standard grade school narrative. What if the American Revolution was actually the result of a century-long world war? It's super easy to just fall back on the myth that, well, taxes are bad, so the colonists revolted, right? But the reality is way more complex. We've got to look at the massive global forces, the constantly shifting empires, and the staggering economics that truly set the stage for the United States.
Section 1. A Century of Colonial Wars. To really grasp how those economic disputes snowballed, we need to jump back to the late 17th century. This was an era where European powers, mainly Britain, France, and Spain, were just constantly clashing over North American territories. I mean, look at this timeline. We start with King William's War in 1689, rolling almost immediately into Queen Anne's War in 1701, and then hitting King George's War in 1742. This sheer volume of fighting was plaguing the colonies decades before the idea of a revolution even crossed anyone's mind. For over 50 years, Europe was basically treating the colonies as their own personal battleground for succession disputes and land grabs. And the crazy part? The result of all that bloodshed was endless wars, totally undefined borders, and pretty much nothing gained. Every time a peace treaty was signed over in Europe, the North American borders just reverted back to how they were before the war. These early conflicts absolutely exhausted the colonists, not to mention decimating the Native American populations caught in the crossfire. Imagine fighting brutal wars for European kings only to have the land you fought for handed right back. That resentment, that was the very first domino falling.
Which brings us to Section 2, Smuggling and Severed Ears. So those grand macro-level territorial disputes between kings, they started morphing into these bizarre, highly violent trade wars. Take the War of Jenkins' Ear in 1739. The British were fed up with Spain's mercantile stranglehold over trade in South America and the Caribbean. So when Spanish officials boarded a British ship called the Rebecca looking for smuggled sugar, they supposedly tortured the captain, Robert Jenkins, and literally cut off his ear. Jenkins actually paraded his severed ear before the British Parliament, which, no surprise, sparked a war. It's an absurd escalation, sure, but it perfectly illustrates just how intense and violent these trade disputes had actually become. Because you have to remember, behind that severed ear was unbelievable wealth. The massive value of the American colonies was heavily propped up by the triangle trade. We're talking sugar, molasses, and of course the horrific, ever-expanding use of enslaved labor. Because the Americas were generating such astounding wealth, the whole region had turned into an absolute powder keg for economic conflict. Moving on to Section 3, the 7 Years' War. Okay, so what started as a local skirmish in the North American woods completely exploded into the largest European land war the world had ever seen up to that point. It plays out like a movie thriller. Step 1. In 1753, a young Virginia major named George Washington is ordered to push the French out of the Ohio River Valley. Step 2. A year later, things escalate. The French capture a British fort, and Washington engages a French encampment. Step 3. In a wild turn of events, his native ally kills the wounded French commander, prompting Washington to quickly build a makeshift defense called Fort Necessity. And finally, Step 4. French troops surround him, forcing his surrender. This incredible micro-story of young Washington accidentally set the entire world on fire. It sparked a global conflict that would eventually tear the British Empire apart. 1.4 million. That is the estimated number of total casualties from the 7 Years' War worldwide. I mean, the scale of this conflict was just brutal and devastating. And while the British technically won the war, securing vast new territories in North America, they also took on a staggering, absolutely back-breaking amount of debt to finance that global victory. Section 4, The Cost of Empire.
So, the British Empire is victorious, right? But they are waking up to a massive financial hangover. Somebody had to pay the bill. This financial burden ended up splitting the empire's ideology right down the middle. Look at it from the British view. They felt the war was fought partly to protect the colonists, so naturally the colonists needed to pay their fair share. Plus, Parliament argued the colonists already had what they called virtual representation. But the colonist view was just as firm. As British subjects, they believed any taxation without direct, physical representation in Parliament completely violated their fundamental rights. Neither side was necessarily trying to be the villain here. They were just totally divided by the harsh economics of running a post-war empire.
Which leads to our final part, Section 5, Trade Disputes to Revolution. Let's track this final cascade of dominoes. Britain is desperately trying to regain financial control, but they end up inadvertently pushing the colonies right over the edge. In 1764, we get the Sugar Act. Just a year later, the Stamp Act hits, placing a direct tax on official paper, playing cards, deeds, which sparks massive outrage and births the Sons of Liberty. Then, the 1767 Townshend Acts tax everyday goods like glass, lead, and tea. And finally, the 1773 Tea Act undercuts the local merchants. Britain was slowly, methodically tightening the economic noose to extract revenue. But man, every single pull of that rope just escalated colonial tension into more boycotts and more violent protests.
And that tension? It had deadly consequences. 5. That is the number of colonists killed in the 1770 Boston Massacre. What started as just an argument between a young apprentice and a British sentry outside a customs house escalated into a full-blown mob, and eventually ragged volley fire from British troops. It's a stark example of how rising tensions over customs regulations spilled directly into deadly street violence. Then, following the Tea Act of 1773, the Sons of Liberty organized a massive protest. They dumped 342 crates of British East India Company tea straight into Boston Harbor. To put that into perspective, that's the equivalent of $1.7 million in today's money. This wasn't just some symbolic gesture. It was a devastating economic blow that absolutely infuriated the British Parliament.
And the British response was incredibly heavy-handed. Step 1. Parliament passes the Intolerable Acts, designed specifically to punish Massachusetts economically and politically. Step 2. The colonists unify in response, forming the First Continental Congress to organize a massive boycott. Step 3. Fast forward to April 1775. British troops march to seize a cache of colonial weapons at Concord. Which brings us to Step 4. The militia stands their ground at Lexington, firing the shot heard round the world. You can see exactly how economic punishment directly forced this military confrontation. As our source perfectly sums it up, the resentment and anger boiled over at last, and the war began. It is so crucial to remember that when the American Revolution kicked off, it wasn't initially this grand quest to create a brand new country. It was a rebellion aimed at reclaiming their existing rights as British subjects. But the sheer momentum of it all, a century of warfare, endless trade disputes, and brutal economic suppression, it pushed them completely past the point of reconciliation, straight toward total independence. So I want to leave you with this provocative thought. When we look back at this inescapable domino effect, we really have to ask ourselves, are revolutions truly born from pure ideology? Or are they simply the final violent result of broken economics and century-long trade disputes? It completely shifts how we look at history, and honestly, how we look at modern geopolitical conflicts today. Thank you so much for hanging out with me for this explainer. Keep asking the tough questions, keep examining the underlying structures of history, and I'll catch you next time.